Arhan stepped into the cafe with a hesitant glance around, rubbing his palms together as if trying to smooth away the nerves sitting in his chest. His friends had insisted the blind date would be different and unforgettable, but he had sensed their strange smirks and avoided eye contact. Still, he came because somewhere deep down, he hoped meeting someone new might soften the loneliness that had slowly carved space inside his life after years of raising his daughter alone. The cafe was warm and filled with soft yellow lights, the kind that made every face look softer and every moment feel slightly safer. He scanned the tables, expecting someone confident, someone who would wave at him or call his name, but instead, his eyes fell on a girl by the window, her hands resting gently in her lap as she watched the street outside like she was reading a story no one else could see. She had long hair tucked behind one ear and eyes that were incredibly alive despite the stillness of her body. Her wheelchair was sleek but worn at the handles, the kind that had clearly seen many places and never asked for pity along the way. Before he could turn away, the waitress approached him with a quiet, almost apologetic tone, explaining that the girl was waiting for him and that she was deaf and paralyzed from the waist down. The words hit him like a sudden drop in temperature, not because of her condition, but because he immediately understood what his friends had done. They had pushed him into a situation they thought would be funny or shocking or awkward, and they had used her disability as the punchline. A wave of embarrassment and anger washed through him as he stood frozen, unsure whether he should walk away or confront them later. But then the girl turned her head slightly, her eyes lifting toward him with a soft, nervous curiosity. There was no trace of expectation or pressure in her gaze, only a quiet question: was he here for her, or would he be like the others who pretended not to see her, who avoided sitting near her, who treated her as though her presence required courage to acknowledge? Something inside him shifted as he stood there, watching her wait with a fragile kind of hope she probably didn't even realize she was showing. She tapped her fingers lightly against the side of her chair, the movement small but rhythmic, as if it helped her stay grounded while she waited for someone who might or might not show kindness. Arhan took a breath that felt heavier than he expected and walked toward her, each step peeling away the irritation he felt toward his friends and replacing it with something gentler, something protective. When he reached her table, she lifted her eyes again, offering him a small smile, careful, unsure, almost apologetic, as though she was used to people hesitating before deciding whether to stay. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words tangled in his throat as he realized she could not hear them. She noticed his hesitation and her smile wavered for a second, the slightest hint of disappointment flickering in her eyes, not because of him specifically, but because she had seen that hesitation too many times before. Arhan felt his heart pull painfully at the thought, and instead of stepping back, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with a gentle nod, hoping she would understand that for tonight, he wasn't going anywhere. Hania watched him sit, her fingers pausing mid-tap as if she wasn't sure she had understood his intention correctly. There was a faint tremble in her hands, the kind that came from someone who had learned to expect disappointment even in moments that looked hopeful. She reached slowly for the small digital communication board on the table, its screen scratched at the corners from years of use. Her eyes stayed on him as she typed, each keystroke deliberate, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. When the board finally spoke for her, the robotic voice was soft, almost gentle, repeating the words she had typed. "I know you were not expecting me." The sentence hung between them, fragile and exposed. Arhan felt it sink into him, heavier than it sounded. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of the awkward setting, it was a glimpse into her daily reality, a reality where people pulled away the moment they realized conversation with her required patience, where her wheelchair became the first thing they saw, and the last thing they allowed themselves to look past. Arhan lowered his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts, then slowly picked up the board and typed his response with careful fingers. "I'm here now, and I'm staying." She read it, and something in her posture changed. Her shoulders, which had been slightly raised in silent anticipation of rejection, eased down. Her expression softened, and for the first time since he arrived, she looked at him directly, without the shield of cautiousness. She typed again, telling him that she loved watching sunsets even though she couldn't hear the wind or the waves that usually accompanied them. As the screen repeated her message, she looked embarrassed, like she thought she was saying something trivial or uninteresting. But Arhan leaned forward, fascinated by the way her eyes glowed when she shared something she loved. He found himself studying the small details, The way her eyelashes fluttered when she was unsure, the way her fingers moved with incredible precision despite their slight tremble, the way she seemed so delicate and strong at the same time. He typed a question asking what colors she liked to paint sunsets with, and when she read it, her face brightened with a spark so pure it made his chest grow warm. She explained through the board that she used deep oranges for hope, soft purples for the quiet parts of the day, and bright gold for moments she wished she could hear. As she typed, her eyes flicked between the screen and his face, checking if he was still interested, still present, still willing to meet her halfway. Arhan nodded often, letting his smile reassure her every time doubt flickered across her expression. Minutes passed, turning into more than he expected. The initial awkwardness faded like dust being brushed off a forgotten window. He found himself relaxing, leaning in closer, almost forgetting that they weren't speaking out loud. She told him she rarely went on dates, not because she didn't want to, but because people usually disappeared after 5 minutes or never showed up at all. There was no bitterness in the message she typed, only a quiet acceptance that made his stomach twist. She hesitated before typing again, her fingers slower this time. When the board spoke, its words hit him deeper than he expected. I won't be offended if you want to leave. Most people do. Arhan stared at the sentence, feeling something inside him tighten painfully. He reached for the board again, but instead of typing immediately, he paused, making sure she was looking at him. When she lifted her eyes, he let her see the sincerity in his own before he wrote his answer. He typed that he wasn't most people, that he wasn't going anywhere, and that he wanted to know everything she felt comfortable sharing. As she read the words, her breath caught in the slightest, barely visible movement, her eyes softening with something that looked like relief, gratitude, and a hint of disbelief all merged together. She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to feel seen. Hours seemed to blend seamlessly as they continued, communicating, the cafe growing quieter around them. Hania's fingers danced gently over her board, her motions confident when she spoke about art but slower, more hesitant, when she drifted into pieces of her life. She told him how silence wasn't empty for her, how she had learned to fill it with imagination, colors, and the movements of people she watched from afar. She wrote that she could read emotions more easily than lips, and that often, she knew when people were uncomfortable long before they said a word. Arhan felt his chest tighten, realizing how much she must have absorbed over the years, how many small hurts she had quietly collected without ever saying them out loud. She typed that people often approached her with exaggerated pity, the kind that made her feel more like an obligation than a person. She wrote about strangers who spoke loudly even though she couldn't hear, about people who assumed she was unintelligent because she didn't communicate the way they did, about the times children stared but adults pulled them away as though curiosity were shameful. Each sentence carried the weight of experiences she had learned to accept but had never truly healed from. Arhan listened with a stillness he didn't know he was capable of, absorbing every detail as if understanding her world meant something sacred. The board spoke again, repeating her next message in its soft robotic voice, a message that made his stomach drop with a dull ache. She wrote that some people had gone on dates with her out of guilt, some out of curiosity, and a few out of mockery disguised as kindness. She looked away as the board read the words, her eyes drifting to the window like she wanted to blend into the dimming evening light. For a moment, she didn't type anything, her hands resting quietly, her face calm but undeniably vulnerable. Arhan felt anger simmer beneath his skin, a protective anger that surprised him by its intensity. He had come tonight expecting an awkward setup or a forced conversation, not this glimpse into a life that had required so much resilience just to exist in a world that often overlooked her. He wanted to tell her she deserved more than the treatment she had received, that the world had been shallow, not her, but he forced himself not to overwhelm her with words she couldn't hear or rely solely on tone. Instead, he picked up the board and typed slowly, making sure each word carried the sincerity she deserved. He told her that anyone who had walked away from something extraordinary. When she read it, her eyes widened with a startled softness, like she wasn't used to someone choosing empathy without hesitation. She tapped her fingers nervously on the table, her gaze flicking between his face and the message she had just typed but hadn't yet sent. Finally, she pressed the button, letting the board voice her thoughts. I hope I'm not ruining your evening. Arhan blinked in disbelief, the idea so far from reality that he almost laughed from the shock of it. He shook his head quickly, reaching for the board with an urgency that made her stare. He typed that she wasn't ruining anything, that talking to her felt different in the best possible way, that the silence with her didn't feel heavy or awkward, it felt peaceful, warm, honest. She read his message slowly, her eyes tracing each word more than once. Her lips parted with a soft breath, and for the first time since their meeting began, her posture loosened completely. She leaned back in her wheelchair, her expression open, unguarded, and touched by a fragile comfort she didn't seem accustomed to letting herself feel. And for the first time in a very long while, she allowed herself to believe that someone might truly want to be there with her, not out of pity. Not out of curiosity, but simply because they enjoyed her presence. The cafe had grown quieter, the soft hum of evening settling in as the sky outside deepened into shades of blue. The warm lights inside reflected softly on the window, casting a gentle glow around them as if the world had decided to pause for their conversation. Arhan found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't felt in years, his shoulders no longer tense, the lines on his forehead softening as he listened to her through the board's steady voice. Hania typed slowly, telling him about her dream of becoming an art teacher for children with disabilities, how she imagined a classroom filled with colors, gentle communication, and a space where every child felt seen. As she typed, her eyes lit with a quiet fire, a passion so deeply rooted that it made her entire face come alive with purpose. She explained how she had spent years learning ways to teach without relying on sound, using visual cues, lights, and textures. She wrote about her belief that art was for everyone, that creativity wasn't limited by physical ability or by the thoughts society projected onto a person. Every time she shared something about her dream, her fingers moved with growing confidence, her posture straightening as though the act of speaking about what she loved gave her strength. Arhan watched, fascinated, feeling something warm build inside him as he saw her not as someone the world pitied but as someone who carried a brilliance most people would never slow down long enough to notice. When she paused, she gestured gently for him to speak about himself. He hesitated for a moment, not used to someone genuinely wanting to hear his story. But then he began typing about his daughter, Aisha, and how being a single father had been the hardest and most beautiful chapter of his life. He told her about the mornings that began too early, about school projects he didn't always understand, about the endless responsibilities that kept him exhausted but proud. She read each word with a focus so intense he felt like she was absorbing more than what he had written, as if she was listening not just with her eyes but with her entire heart. He told her how people often assumed he had everything under control, even when he barely felt steady. He confessed quietly that some nights he worried he wasn't enough, that he couldn't give his daughter everything she deserved. Hania's eyes softened as she read, and she typed her response with the slow, thoughtful movement of someone choosing each word with care. The board repeated her message, telling him that his daughter was lucky to have a father who showed up, who stayed, who loved with the kind of consistency the world rarely offered. Her words sank into him, deeper than she could ever know. No one had said those things to him in years. He felt something loosen in his chest, something he had tightly held together for too long. Hania noticed the slight shift in his expression, the way his eyes glistened with unspoken emotion, and she didn't look away. Instead, she held his gaze with quiet understanding, offering him comfort without needing sound or touch. They sat there, sharing pieces of themselves in a way that felt strangely effortless. The silence between their exchanged messages no longer felt empty but warm, like it had become a safe space just for the two of them. The world outside moved on, cars passing, people walking, lights flickering on across the street, but inside that small cafe, it felt like time had slowed just enough for them to breathe in each other's presence without fear or judgment. When they finally stepped outside, the night air wrapped around them with a cool gentleness, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The streetlights cast soft halos on the pavement, their glow catching in Hania's hair as Arhan walked beside her, pushing her wheelchair with a steady, careful pace. The world outside the cafe felt quieter, not because of silence but because something warm lingered between them, something fragile and unexpected that neither of them was ready to name. Hania looked up at the sky, her eyes following the faint traces of purple that still clung to the horizon, the last remnants of the sunset she loved so much. She pointed toward it with a small smile, and he understood instantly that she saw beauty everywhere, even in moments most people rushed past without noticing. They reached the taxi stand, the hum of distant traffic blending with the soft glow of headlights sweeping across the street. Arhan moved around to face her, unsure if he should say goodbye, unsure if he even wanted the moment to end. Hania reached for her board again, her movements slower than before, as though each word she was about to write carried weight. She typed a long message, one that took her time, her fingers trembling slightly with each letter. Arhan watched her, noticing how she paused every few seconds, gathering courage before continuing, her breath uneven with the emotional effort of choosing honesty over safety. When she finally pressed the button, the board's voice spoke her thoughts aloud, a fragile confession woven through each word. She wrote that she knew their meeting hadn't been planned the way most dates were, that she understood it was meant to be a joke at his expense, but somehow, she felt grateful it had happened anyway. She wrote that being with him tonight made her feel human again, not as an object of pity or someone people avoided, but as a woman who could be talked to, laughed with, seen. She told him she didn't expect anything from him, didn't want him to feel pressure or guilt, she only wanted to thank him for giving her a few hours where she didn't feel like a burden or a mistake someone had to tolerate. Her eyes stayed on the screen as the words played, almost as if she wasn't brave enough to look at him while her heart was exposed like that. When the last word was spoken, she finally lifted her gaze, her expression soft but shadowed with a quiet fear of his reaction. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that struck him harder than anything she had said earlier, a vulnerability shaped by years of rejection, years of hiding her feelings behind polite smiles, years of pretending she didn't care when people walked away too soon. Arhan felt something shift inside him, something raw and powerful that he hadn't felt in a long time. The way she spoke about herself, the way she saw her own presence as something he had put up with, broke something open in him that he didn't realize had been sealed shut. He could see how deeply she undervalued her own worth, how much the world's cruelty had quietly carved into her heart until she believed she should apologize for simply existing. It hit him with a force that made his throat tighten, his breath grow unsteady. He took a small step closer, lowering himself to her height, trying to find the right words but knowing words would never be enough. The street around them kept moving, taxis slowing down and speeding up, people passing by with hurried steps, but in that moment, the world felt distant, muted, irrelevant. Hania sat there watching him, her hands folded nervously in her lap, the glow of the streetlight reflecting in her eyes like tiny shards of uncertainty. And as he looked at her, truly looked at her, he realized she had no idea how strong she appeared to him, how inspiring her resilience was, how quietly beautiful she had been from the moment he walked into the cafe. She had no idea how deeply her honesty had touched him, how much her presence had softened corners of his heart he had forgotten were still tender. Arhan lowered himself down until he was kneeling beside her wheelchair, the cold pavement pressing through the fabric of his trousers, but he didn't care. He wanted to be at her eye level, wanted her to see every bit of sincerity in his face so she would understand that nothing she had said was insignificant. The noise of the street faded into a soft hum behind them, the world moving on without noticing the moment unfolding under the pale glow of a street lamp. Hania blinked in uncertainty, her breath catching as she watched him come closer, her fingers curling slightly on the armrest as if bracing herself for disappointment she had come to expect. He told her, slowly, carefully, using his hands and the board, that she wasn't broken, that nothing about her deserved apology, that her presence tonight had meant more to him than she could ever imagine. His voice wavered as he spoke, not from pity but from a raw emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years, the kind that made the edges of his words softer, more human. He typed that she was brave in a way people rarely understood, that she had lived through loneliness he couldn't even imagine, and yet she still moved through the world with gentleness and hope. Hania stared at the board, her lips parting in a silent breath as the message played. She looked stunned, as if the words were too tender, too undeserved, too foreign to believe. Her eyes misted over, the kind of tears that weren't loud or dramatic but quiet, trembling, born from years of not being seen. She looked away for a moment, swallowing hard, her jaw tightening as though she was trying to keep her emotions from spilling too quickly. When she finally turned back to him, her gaze was softer, vulnerable in a way that made his chest ache. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the board again, the motion small and slow, as if each movement required more courage than the last. She typed only a few words this time, a short message that she hesitated to send, her thumb hovering over the button for several long seconds. Arhan watched her, his breath held without realizing it, sensing that whatever she was about to say carried a weight she had never allowed herself to express aloud. When she finally pressed the button, the board's voice spoke quietly into the night, its tone robotic but the meaning behind it piercing straight through him. No one has ever said that. The words hit him like a blow to the heart, sudden and devastating in their simplicity. He felt tears rush to the edge of his vision before he could stop them, blurring the shapes of the passing headlights and the glow of the city around them. He blinked rapidly, not out of embarrassment but because her words carried a truth so painful, so unfair, that it hollowed him out from the inside. She sat there watching him, her expression a mixture of wonder and fear, as if she had revealed something she wasn't sure the world was willing to hold gently. Her hands twitched in her lap, her shoulders drawing in slightly as though she was preparing herself for him to step back, to pull away, to treat her confession as something uncomfortable. But Arhan didn't move away. He reached forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull back, and gently took her hand in his. Her fingers were cool and delicate, stiff with uncertainty at first, then slowly relaxing as she realized he wasn't letting go. The contact was soft but grounding, a promise made without sound. In that moment, under the dim lights and the quiet presence of the city around them, he felt something shift inside him, something that had been dormant for far too long. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't obligation. It was the kind of emotion that rose from the center of the chest, warm and steady, something that made his breath slow and his heart feel heavier in the best possible way. Hania's eyes shimmered, reflecting the streetlight like tiny mirrors, and for the first time that night, she didn't look away. She held his gaze, letting him see the fragile hope she had kept hidden behind years of silence and unspoken longing. And in that quiet, unbroken moment between them, the world felt softer, kinder, as if it had finally stopped to witness two lonely hearts daring to believe they didn't have to stay lonely anymore.